This program is sponsored in part by the National Catholic Society of Foresters. Hello again, and welcome to Looking at Social Justice. I'm Jim Grant, and as I've said before, the joy of this program is meeting and interviewing and visiting with friends over very important topics that are also very engaging and important and interesting at the same time. Now, I'd like to begin by telling you the urgency of the topic before I even tell you who's going to help us address it. It's all about the environment. Pope Francis, as you know, 4 years ago wrote a very major statement, an encyclical Laudato Si, on caring for our common home. 3 weeks ago, that would be June 18th, 2019, the California bishops wrote a follow-up statement, 42 pages, trying to help us in California become very practical about implementing this major statement of Pope Francis. But Pope Francis didn't leave it there. On June 14th, when he was addressing a major gathering in Rome of major players in the environmental issue, he made 3 important points. One of them is we need an immediate and a just transition from the way we are living to the way is sustainable for the world. Secondly, carbon pricing is an essential part of that. We need to take care of penalizing polluters and having them pay for what they do so it doesn't land on the innocent. And thirdly, transparency. We need to address this in a way that everyone knows we're in this together. Finally, he concluded saying, it's time that we do it now. We're running out of time, but we can rise above ourselves and do this. We have about a decade, he says, so let's get on this. Kevin Hall, my good friend, 20 years ago decided to switch from what he was maybe doing at that time to become totally committed to work on the environment. He has been doing this as a person, as an advocate, as a community organizer, political organizer, labor organizer. And today he's going to share with us part 1 of a presentation of his own basic overture on the topic of why we need to address the issue not only nationally, but locally. The topic is the politics of climate change in the San Joaquin Valley. Kevin, why don't you remind us why this is for you the most important issue we need to deal with as a country, as a state, as a part in the state in the Central Valley?
That's a great question to begin with. I have to confess that it's for the most selfish of reasons. I'm a father, and 20 years ago when my son was 7, almost 8 years old, my wife Ann and I were out at a bookstore here at the north end of town. We'd been to the movies, and then you go for a cup of coffee and browse the titles, and she picked up one called Maybe One, A Case for Smaller Families by a man named Bill McKibben. And I hadn't heard of McKibben, and I had not, of course, seen the book. So as parents of an only child, we were interested in the topic, but it turned out to be a book initially about that, but truly about climate change. And it was an awakening. I call it a slap in the face, if you will. And that led me and Ann into a 6-month period of research on the topic. That basically was a change in our lives as individuals and as a family. And since then, I've done a combination of volunteering and where I work to try and work to build power so that we can address these issues.
So when you accepted my offer to have a podcast YouTube program with us today, you did decide where you'd like to go with your sharing in 2 parts.
Yep.
Where do you want to start with
Well,
that presentation?
I think you started at the right point exactly, Jim, and the Pope and the bishops in California are right on track and right on the message. It's very refreshing and it's very encouraging and it's very much needed. And what they're tying this urgency to is a report that the United Nations released in October, and it's the 1.5 degrees centigrade increase report in global average temperatures. And the quick backstory on that, if I may, is just this. For years we've been studying what happens if we hit the 2.0 centigrade increase worldwide. And the island nations asked the UN to examine the 1.5 threshold and answer the question, what does it look like then? And the report came back, released in October, that said, well, everything's happening much faster than we had thought. And the threshold we're as worried about now is the 1.5 degree threshold. And they point out in the report that, and this again is to the Pope's decade, he said, the report says by the year 2030, we need to reduce our energy, our carbon emissions from energy by half, and essentially by 2045, 2050, we need to be 100% free of all combustion. That's every form of burning, any type of material or matter. And that is an undertaking beyond the scale of anything in human history. And it is mind-boggling to try and contemplate. And so it's really important to have a spiritual base in one's life in order to live with this reality. And to have a spiritual leader who is offering that is very unusual and very, very important.
Now, one element that you wanted to bring up, I don't know if it's exactly now, but it's definitely during our talk, the Green New Deal. It's something that some people are exactly committed to, and yet there is, in this country, obviously, a reluctance to do anything that's going to be bold and intense, because we do things half measures. We have to make sure everybody's happy. So where did you want to go with introducing us to the whole possibility of redesigning, re-understanding, restructuring society with a Green New Deal?
Well, you are jumping ahead. If you want to jump ahead, we could. If you
pull
want
us
to do a
back.
quick synopsis of the steps so that we'll do that, I think that's great.
Pull us where you want
Yeah,
to
well,
go.
let's do the overview. You know, the first part is, there are some very serious news we're facing, and that's the first report we talked about, and there's another report we should touch on. Secondly, there is a lot of hope. Okay, there is a plan to turn this thing around, and that's the Green New Deal. And as a part of that hope, there are leaders, young leaders, who are stepping out in remarkable ways, both in the U.S. Congress, but also internationally. Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old Swedish activist who is really turning the world mindset around. And then there's an urgency here, and that's the third part of the conversation, as the Pope has laid out. I won't repeat that now. And then finally, the yes we can part, that this can be done, it has to be done, and whatever we get done is to the good of the future generations, especially the people we know now. So if we take the conversation, as we have a couple of shows here to take those four parts, what my main goal here now and why I'm going out and giving presentations is what's needed most is people need to find the courage to have the conversations about climate change with the people they love most. It's actually the most difficult conversation to have. And then with our extended networks of friends and social circles, we all need to be thinking about this very seriously. If we're not, it's as if Pearl Harbor and 9/11 happened on the same day, and we all chose to ignore it. It doesn't have that sense of urgency because it's a longer term impact. But in terms of the scale of action needed and the speed of action needed, we have to be responding as the greatest generation did in response to the threat of fascism worldwide in World War II. So that's my overview. And while it's somber and it's serious, there is plenty of hope, and there is real meaning in this work, and there's life in this work.
The idea of the urgency matched with hope. I'm so glad that that was something, as we were walking in, we both agreed on, because to not see the urgency or to not have a hope that we can respond to the urgency, unless they're both operative, nothing will happen. Some people see the urgency and they're totally depressed. And other people do not even see the urgency because they think we're just going merrily along and it's all okay. So thanks for bringing in, Kevin, those two principles that as we look at what the rest of the presentation is, we know that those two are in play all the time. We're not depressed, but we are concerned, and we've got to do something about it.
Yeah, you know, thanks. Yeah, the way I live this is that as what happened 20 years ago, is I've taken in this information, I've taken it seriously. I didn't stop with one book. I went on to read Ross Gelbspann's The Heat Is On. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning author who wrote about the climate change conspiracy and the cover-up, keeping in mind, right, that the fossil fuel interests for decades have been funding an anti-science campaign while knowing the true science, or the accurate science. And as kind of like the cigarette companies did, where you don't claim to be against the science, you just say we need better science. And then you seek to delay any action. And they've effectively done that. You know, in the last 30 years, I'm jumping around now, Jim, but I'll just make this one point and we'll go to the structure. In the last 30 years, half of all greenhouse gas emissions emitted have been produced. So think about it in this context. 30 years ago is when Dr. James Hansen went to the US Congress and said, climate change is real, we must act on it, and instead, he had his funding yanked, and the climate cover-up really kicked into high speed, and greenhouse gas emissions skyrocketed for 3 decades. Had we started then, the change in the scale of change and the speed of it would be so much more manageable, rather than having to knock out 3 to 10% a year. Now I'm sorry, much less than that, 3 to 4% a year. Now we're looking at 10 to 15%. So again, immense challenges. So back to that, if we may, maybe we'll take the two reports, the UN report on the 1.5 degree increase. The most important and most alarming part of that report is they said what we're looking at are reaching tipping points sometime between the years 2030 and 2050. And a tipping point is a physical phenomenon where you create a negative feedback loop in a natural setting. Take, say, the Arctic Ocean, where normally it's frozen over most of the year and it creates ice that it sends out. Well, as that's ceasing to happen, that birthing center of that ice has now become what they call a crematorium, because the icebergs are dying there and the ice is melting, and what we are seeing now is much more ocean, and that means much more dark surface, which absorbs more heat, whereas normally that ice reflects the light off into space, and it's a very important part of our climate, our stable climate, the balance of it. So the point being that as the ice recedes and more ocean is exposed, you get more heat. Well, you get more heat, well, you get more melt, you get more ocean exposed, and you create this feedback loop that you can't stop. The more insidious one is probably with methane in the permafrost and the tundra, as well as beneath the shallow ocean on a continental shelf. We have uncalculated stores of methane. Well, they've been calculated, but phenomenally high stores of methane and carbon that, if released as methane when devoured by the microorganisms that are allowed to flourish when the ice melts, that we can't stop it. We can't turn it back because it becomes just self-reinforcing, and the amounts involved are so much greater than what we emit as humans that at that point the genie is out of the bottle. The report highlights 6 of these potential tipping points. People are probably thinking already, well, what about the ice melting, right, in Antarctica and in Greenland? Again, the same. And again, they create their own feedback loops. Think of a cathedral with a flying buttress, some beautiful architecture. Well, in Antarctica, that's how the ice shelves work. Most of that ice is on land, and much of it is also out over the ocean. And those oceans have been described as those pieces of ice over the water have been described as buttresses to the landlocked ice. Well, guess what's melting? And when those go, guess what follows? So the island nations that requested the report were pointing out that Indonesia, for example, is moving its capital of Jakarta. Jakarta has to move because of the rising oceans. So they're saying, look, we're already losing land. How bad is it going to be and how soon? And that's where they came back with the answer. We got to cut it by half by 2030 and all of it by 2050. And if we don't, we risk crossing one of these tipping points. So that's the first major report. That came out in October. Jim, it hit me as hard as the very first reading I did 20 years ago.
The one, was that in like the New Yorker? And it wound up being, when Peggy and I read this last year, it was like, how did we miss this? It's an expose of, we had every possibility of addressing what was a diagnosed issue, but it was just shelved, which is what you were telling us. But to become aware that something that was as clearly presented scientifically could be dismissed by the government, and then to know that right now we're reading even today in the Bee, that the weather for the valley, the weather for most of California, is on this trajectory that whatever we're getting used to of 100-degree temperatures and 105 temperatures and 120-degree temperatures, they're all on a projected climb.
Yeah.
So it's like, why didn't we? And is there still, I guess one issue, I'm throwing it in early, there is time to do what? How do we turn back what was 30 years of dismissal by all the administrations? We can say right now, oh, it is so bad right now with what's going on in Washington, which it is. But to think that for 3 decades, we've been asleep at the watch. That may be a big bad curveball, but...
Thank you for curveballs. The answer is greed. Next question. Sorry, but do you know that the one, Naomi Klein's critique of that expose in, I think it was the New York Times,
Yes.
That author, that reporter, had a huge blind spot to the economic mentality at the time. In the 1980s, well, my topic is the politics of climate change, right? And so the politics of the situation is, you're right, we cannot blame just the current administration or say even just the Republican Party, because they have just as much responsibility as the Democrats do. The Democrats are the modern era are best described as deregulation Democrats. And we have spent the last 30, 40 years actually stripping away nearly every protection in the financial sector that came about after the hard-earned, learned lessons of the Great Depression, and the protections that were put in place to maintain separations between commercial banks and investment banks and speculative investments, or you know, just think about it. If you're, I turned 60 this year. If you're in the generation that came out of college, say, before 1984, you don't know what it is to be a young person today. There is almost no similarity in terms of what is available to one in regard to education and opportunity. There's just been a steady erosion, and well, I put it one other way, and I haven't worked up this chart yet, it's out there. But if you look at the separation between the people at the very top of the economy, and I mean the 1% of the 1%, you know, the 500 billionaires worldwide who, you know, have well over half of the planet's wealth and resources now. We've emerged into this society almost of kings with immense wealth and a large peasant underclass that is exploited and considered expendable. And this separation has led to the companion impact, which is environmental collapse. And I've just taken a long circuit back to my second report. I should say just on the greed part, Jim, that if you were to track this separation over the last 30 to 40 years, it parallels the increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And I know there are other ways to do this. People say, well, what is in America, at least in the US, what is the average CEO compensation as a factor of the median worker compensation? And we're, you know, 30, 40 years ago, it was 30 to 1. Now it's 300, 400 to 1. There's been a really dramatic change in the economic structure of our society, of our country. It's a very big change, and we're mostly unaware of it because we just become accustomed to it. So I'm not arguing any political philosophy here. What I'm trying to suggest, especially for people of faith who want to imbue their lives with values that speak to the need to care for all living things, then I encourage people to just really consider that we have an economic system that is built on the need to always show profit in such a way that you ignore your impacts. And that's landed us in this pickle that we are creating impacts that we can't or we won't be able to reverse unless we take dramatic action.
Just to bring up another encyclical of Pope Francis that bears out this point, Kevin, you just made, when he wrote The Joy of the Gospel, which sounds like that can't be economic. I don't see the word economy in the joy of the gospel. It's actually an indictment of how society has abused the majority of people by its economic inequity.
Yeah.
And he says in that encyclical, this economy kills. So
Wow.
I only want to echo and let you continue, but this idea of the economic system being the problem, I think we're not off track at all. You wanted to look at the politics of climate change? It's the economy. And we're going to see that the Green New Plan that we're going to look at a little later is going to be having a critique saying, but if you go along with capitalism as it is, it's dead in the water, because it's asking for a lot more than just a little wrinkle of a change. It's asking for a tremendous re-understanding of equity and human existence and the dignity of every human being. So we have 3 minutes left for this one program. Figure out how you'd like to finish with whatever you wanted to do for 3 minutes, and we'll be back right afterwards with another 30 minutes to keep going in a direction you'd like to go.
Well, I think that we've, as I said at the top, is I'm trying to get people to talk to one another, and I think you want to have a structure to every conversation. So what we've been doing is called the agitation piece, where you share the troubling information, but we need to talk about the hope, which is the Green New Deal. We'll talk about the urgency and the yes we can, because I know we can do this, Jim. So, and we're all going to work on finding that courage to have these conversations. But if we get agitated about something like this, the only way to resolve that is through action. Now, I recognize a lot of people say, well, prayer gets me there too. And I agree with that. But it's how you act. Prayer takes you to action. When my experience, at least, of this is when I sit with this, what I find is I have to act. And in fact, I was raised, initially taught by the Sisters of the Immaculate Conception out in Firebaugh. They were from Madrid at St. Joseph's, all right?
Yes.
They taught us
They are
this:
awesome.
actions speak louder than words.
Absolutely.
Okay? So we'll talk about the actions in the next half. How about that?
Absolutely. You've got a minute, though. What would be a final thought as you wrap up this particular program?
This particular section is we didn't really talk much about the UN Extinction Report, and its most important message is that species are dying at a rate that is 10,000 times the normal rate. It's a clear indication that the system is collapsing worldwide. And they say the most important thing we can do is to preserve natural landscapes and to restore them. And that is also the most important thing we can do for climate change. So these two reports together are like two punches that one is as important as the other. And that you couldn't have louder bells being rung to say, okay, party's over, time for the adults to step up and take responsibility.
I want to thank you for this first conversation, which, as you said, we maybe covered only one little part of what is going to be a major conversation in our second program. But this agitation that you really helped us clarify as, wow, we were really agitated, or I was really agitated. A good place to start, but not a good place to finish. It's like, unless we can move from that agitation to something that is concrete, practical, doable, actionable, we're just going to be spinning our wheels and being very angry. And I'll close with Pope Francis. He would be echoing that we must not give up. We must move on, but we must believe that we are better than what we've been doing so far. We can change. So thanks for the first show. We'll be back again. Second program coming right up. Stay tuned.